which is good. But if you go back to the comments from the Reserve Bank Governor about the anchor point at 3.5, it shows that even at that point we are well behind inflation and well behind where wages we would want to see them. So with all of that, what we have to remember with wages is government policies to improve wages started taking their effect from the 1st of July. And the three things that we need to do are to continue to use the Fair Work Commission. We did that with the annual wage review. We're doing that with the aged care case. We need to be closing loopholes that drive wages down. And I've had quite a bit to say about that lately. And thirdly, we need to get enterprise bargaining moving, and we look to the Jobs Summit to be able to do that. Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tony. In the interest of brevity, let me just make a couple of points about wages and then the Jobs Summit issues paper that we've released today. We're pleased to see wages growth picking up again, but it's well short of inflation, and that means real wages are still going backwards substantially. In fact, we've got the strongest the strongest wages growth of 2.6% since the September quarter of 2014, at the same time as we've got the biggest fall in real wages since the series began in 1998. So we've got wages growth picking up in welcome ways, but real wages falling because of the inflation challenge that we are currently dealing with. A key focus of the Jobs and Skills Summit will be how do we get wages growing at a sustainable rate again so that Australians aren't falling further and further behind. Wages growth is a key concern of the Jobs and Skills Summit, but not the only concern. We want to make sure that we're getting productivity growth. We want to make sure that we're filling labour and skill shortages around the country. We want to make sure that we're investing in the industries which will create more of those secure, well-paying jobs into the future. And so today we are releasing, on behalf of the government, the issues paper which will inform the discussion at the Jobs and Skills Summit. The Jobs and Skills Summit is all about bringing people together around our big economic challenges. And we're looking forward to bringing people together here at the beginning of September so that we can work together to deal with some of these big economic challenges, bring the country together, work with the whole country to see where we can find common ground. And so today we're releasing the issues paper, which will inform that discussion. We thank all of the many groups and businesses and unions from around Australia who are already participating really constructively in the conversation leading up to the Jobs and Skills Summit, which is here early in September. Now, the one person who's not participating constructively is Peter Dutton. And in 2 weeks, we've had two failures of leadership from Peter Dutton. First, on the Jobs and Skills Summit, by refusing to participate, refusing to recognise this moment that we have, this opportunity that we have to work together to deal with our challenges, whether it's inflation, labour shortages, getting wages moving again, getting productivity growing again, all of these key economic objectives. He failed on that, and he's failed on Scott Morrison as well. Now, Peter Dutton has been given the opportunity multiple times to strongly condemn Scott Morrison's behaviour, and he hasn't done it. Now, Peter Dutton has emerged as the chief apologist for this diabolical and dictatorial behaviour which has been revealed from Scott Morrison. Now, the dregs of the Scott Morrison government, which are currently in charge of the Liberal and National parties, are trying to pretend that they would be some break from the past, but what we know from his commentary in the last couple of days, emerging as the chief apologist, the chief defender of this dictatorial behaviour, is that Peter Dutton would be absolutely no better than Scott Morrison when it comes to what's been revealed in the last couple of days. Now, the Morrison cabinet is just as guilty as Scott Morrison himself. They have emboldened, they have empowered, they have encouraged this kind of behaviour. The idea that they didn't know that Scott Morrison had these dictatorial tendencies is absolutely ridiculous and absolutely laughable. So whether it's Josh Frydenberg or Peter Dutton or any of these characters, they must have known that Scott Morrison was wandering down this dictatorial path. The idea that they didn't is laughable. They should have stood up and done something about it. They had an opportunity to stand up to Scott Morrison. Instead, they sucked up to Scott Morrison, and that's how we find ourselves in this situation. Hi.
Treasurer, should Scott Morrison resign?
Well, this is a matter for Peter Dutton now. Scott Morrison is a member of Peter Dutton's party room. And so Peter Dutton should be insisting on the right outcome here. It's not for Tony or I to decide whether Scott Morrison resigns from the Parliament. Peter Dutton is the key person here. And he has a choice here. He can continue to suck up to Scott Morrison or he can stand up to him. That's the key test of
So
leadership.
you called him a dictator, essentially. So how could you say that and then say it's not a call for you to make on what you think as a cabinet minister about whether he should remain in Parliament?
Well, I'm saying it's a key test of Peter Dutton's leadership. Scott Morrison is not in our party room. He's in Peter Dutton's party room. And so it's a test of leadership. Peter Dutton has failed 2 tests of leadership in 2 weeks, on the Jobs Summit and on Scott Morrison's dictatorial behaviour. The ball's in his court. We go Paul, and then we go Jared, we go here, and then Shane, then we probably have to knock off then.
The issues paper explains that even before COVID and the current inflation crisis, as productivity was rising, wages were stagnant. For both of you, how do you make sure that those gains are shared in the future? And particularly for Tony Burke, you've talked about cutting red tape to bargaining recently. Should that include easier access to multi-employer bargaining?
Okay, first of all, in terms of wages generally, the previous government had a deliberate strategy to keep wages low, and it worked. This government has a deliberate intention to get wages moving. The first part of that was put to the test when we argued in favour of the increase in the annual wage review, and people right now are in a better situation than they would otherwise be because we did that. We also have to deal with, so there's other processes through the Commission, but there's also legislative changes we need to make. We've talked about the gig economy, we've talked about same job, same pay. We've also talked about, more recently, about unilateral termination of agreements where some workers stood to get up to a 40% immediate pay cut. But the final area is how do you get bargaining moving? Now, for example, I'll give you the simplest example. I, for a long time, have been very sceptical about changes to the Better Off Overall test. I'm not ruling it out. I'm wanting to see what ideas come forward and where we can bring people together with the objective of getting wages moving again. That's what we need. So with the last part of your question, I'm not ruling different areas in or out. I'm not going to be adjudicating on each of them, and the Better Off Overall test is the best example you'll get of something where I've been deeply sceptical about. But if the parties are able to come forward with collective ideas and bring that together in a way that gets wages moving, then I'm interested.
And on the broader point about productivity and wages, you're right to remind us that these challenges haven't been brought to us by COVID or by the recent inflation challenges. A lot of these challenges in productivity and wages are the costs and consequences of a wasted decade of missed opportunities and warped priorities, including wage stagnation deliberately pursued by our predecessors. So we genuinely want to bring people together. We understand that there are a lot of win-wins here when it comes to our economic policy and our policies on the labour market. We want to get productivity growing again. We want to get wages growing in a sustainable way again. And it shouldn't be beyond a country like ours to come together and to seek some common ground on those objectives. Jared.
I just had confirmation the Finance Department has confirmed that then Secretary didn't know that Morrison was the Minister in charge also alongside the other Finance Minister. What concern do you have around transparency between the government and secretaries about who is in charge of the portfolios?
Well, obviously this is a key concern, but the primary concern is Scott Morrison's dictatorial behaviour and the fact that Peter Dutton hasn't strongly condemned it. You know, clearly there are issues. The fact that the Secretary of Finance, the Secretary of Treasury, was not aware that the former Prime Minister had secretly sworn himself into those roles. That's clearly of concern to us. But the primary concern is the Prime Minister's behaviour and now the opposition leader's behaviour in not strongly condemning it.
Treasurer, there are signs in the US that inflation is moderating. Here in Australia, it's expected to peak, I think, at 7.2%. Are there any indications that it's moderating here, that we may see it start to lower earlier than expected?
Well, our expectation, or the Treasury's expectation, is that inflation will peak at 7.75 towards the end of the year. Our expectation for some time has been that the Australian peak in inflation will be later than the American peak in inflation. We obviously welcome the fact that inflation has started to come off the boil a little bit in the United States, but it's still at about 8.5%. I think that's a bit of a sign of the times that we're in. that 8.5% inflation is seen as a better than expected outcome. I think that gives us a sense of what we're up against. Our later peak is a consequence of a whole range of issues. We'd like to see it peak earlier and lower, of course. But we've got serious issues in the supply chains. We've got serious issues in the international environment still. We've got things like the end of the fuel excise relief will obviously have consequences for inflation too. So that's why we have the expectation that we do.
Treasurer, you mentioned in your opening statement you wanted to see sustainable wage growth. What's your definition of sustainable? And the figures today showed the public sector wages growth running at 2.6. This is one of your areas that you can have deliberate impact on. Are you signalling that you support higher wage growth in the public enterprise bargaining arrangements that are coming off or rolling over?
Yeah. Thanks, Shane. And this will have to be the last one. To take those in reverse order, the wages bargaining policy is primarily in Katie Gallagher's portfolio, and she is no doubt putting a lot of thought and work into upcoming bargaining rounds, and so I'm reluctant to kind of walk across that work. On the broader issue about what is sustainable, that will be determined by how quickly we can grow this economy without adding to these inflationary pressures which are holding us back right now and inviting this monetary policy response. And so ideally, if you can have productivity growth growing strongly, and you can have wages growing sustainably as part of an economy which is growing in sustainable and broad and inclusive ways, that would tick all of the boxes for us. I'm a little reluctant to put a very specific number on what our wages target is, but as Tony has mentioned, the Reserve Bank's made a contribution here and others have as well. Our interest is in bringing people together around the big challenges in our labour market and the economy more broadly. Part of that is dealing with this decade of flatlining productivity, dealing with a decade of deliberate wage suppression and wage stagnation. Ideally, we can bring the country together, people from all sides of this conversation, to see where we can find the common ground. And the common ground exists around recognising that we can have strong wages growth in this country if it's sustainable, and part of the puzzle is making sure that we get some of that productivity growth which has been missing from our economy for too long. Thanks very much.